Hello everybody, welcome to the Eternal Card Breakdown, or Eternal Spoiler Breakdown, rather. Today we're going to be looking at some of the upcoming cards from Homecoming. 3 of them were spoiled over the course of yesterday's ECQ, in which a Shimmer Pack deck won, and many exciting times were had. We're going to look over those 3 spoilers and talk about each of them, and what all they do, and where they're good, and whether or not they're good at all. First off is Door Knocker, which we saw the art for previously, and we knew the name of the card, but we hadn't actually gotten a chance to see it. So now we have a weapon that is a double damage 4-cost 1/0 with, if you have no units, you can play Door Knocker wielded by a 0/3 helpful doorbot. So as a 4-cost, it becomes a 2/3 double damage, or you can play it on a unit to give it +1/+0 and double damage. Both of which are pretty underrated for stats, but potentially the modularity of this card is where it tends to shine. I think that overall this looks like it's going to be mostly an underpowered card. It's not going to be something that you're going to be playing in a wide variety of decks, but it's a pretty fascinating pickup if you're grabbing it out of a market or using it in certain types of decks that can actually use to have more Grenadins, or want to have like that level of modularity and have certain tricks that work really well with double damage. There's not that many double damage cards in the game, so the more of them that there are, the more likely you are to approach a sort of critical mass of double damage stuff, where you can play with your 2/3 Huru double damage Rilgon's Disciple, you can play with your Steely-Eyed Pistoliers, you can play with your Red Canyon Smugglers, of course. Door Knocker. Twin Barrel is not really all that playable of a card, but I would say that Door Knocker is actually a better card than Twin Barrel, despite it being still pretty underpowered in terms of rate, just because Door Knocker provides stats, and also Door Knocker is a better card for being like just something that you can put doorbots on, or put down as a unit, as a 2/3 double damage. And a 2/3 double damage for 4 is really not that bad a stat line. It seems pretty bad because we have Red Canyon Smuggler in the 3 slot, but Red Canyon Smuggler is kind of a horrendously overpowered card that has a lot of power points put into it, and I think that, like, as far as like getting an extra double damage unit that also happens to function as a neat combat trick that can really surprise your opponents and kill your opponents, that actually has some level of like extra value to you, and it's going to be something that you're going to be playing around with and you're going to have a little bit more fun. Doorbot is a 0/3, so it's a 1/3 double damage. Yeah, it'll be a I was rating it as a 2/3 just because it deals 2 damage, so it's a 4-cost 2/3, but only if you aren't counting the fact that you can put spells on it to increase the amount of damage that it has. But regardless, like, I would say that overall this card is not like wildly powerful, but the fact that it does give red decks a certain amount of reach, particularly in lists where you have high amounts of overwhelm. You have cards like Shugo Tactic, you have some interesting 4-drops like Siegebreaker, which don't actually see a lot of play. You have some places where you can actually put these cards, like even in like time decks with Dawnwalker, or anything that has overwhelm cards that are actually pretty beastly, then something like Door Knocker can suddenly provide a surprise 10 to 12 damage, and that's something that I wouldn't necessarily put aside. This card might have a lot more kick than it appears to have, even though it's a card that I wouldn't place my bets on for a ranked setup. Regardless, I think it's decently powerful. I think it's something that you can certainly play around with and have a little bit of fun with. It's got a very good play pattern, so it's certainly worth experimenting with and playing with. Whether or not it's actually going to be a good card is going to be mostly a matter of testing. I think that it might actually have a deck that it slots into, and it might actually be very good in that deck, but that deck's going to require a lot of overwhelm units and a lot of interesting combat tricks like bottoms up or other stuff like that. You can certainly do some wild stuff with it, maybe give it a shot. Like, there are certainly some good options. Love and Shadow is pointing out Sakalis, the Burning Sands, combined with like Dawnwalker. If you want to do like a Praxis Overwhelm list, that's definitely a pretty good spot for it. Any type of situation where you're running a lot of lifesteal units is potentially okay. Flyers tend to do some pretty good stuff with this. If you stick like a Door Knocker on a Shadowlands Border Scout, it's going to draw you 4 cards. Like, there are still places that you'll feel pretty okay about Door Knocker, and then in the situations where it doesn't do its amazing thing, where it's actually a unit that you can play to give double damage and a lot of stats, it is something that you can play as a fairly small, fairly ineffective unit. So while it's pretty low powered, don't count it out. It definitely has some potential. Okay, number 2. Let's go ahead and go with Andric Renegade Priest, since we should save the best for last, question mark. Andric Renegade Priest is a 2/4 yellow, green, and purple card, so it's in Corendon with Pledge, and whenever a player draws an additional card, increase its cost by 3, so the disciplinary weights text, except on a unit that you have to kill to stop that ability from happening. So good anti-control card just for its stat line. It's immune to Torch. It doesn't die to Vanquish either, so it's kind of hard to kill from both angles. This stat line is not very good for pressuring, but because Andric's Empower is a +4/+2, I think that's going to be something that probably doesn't matter too much. It does have a very, very good Empower that's going to give you a decent amount of excellent stuff to it. And the weights effect does affect both players, so potentially if you're not playing your own sort of draw-focused strategy, you can really weigh down your opponent's strategy and do some interesting stuff. But you can't play this in like the same kind of deck as Teacher, where you're playing disciplinary weights for Nightfall and for other stuff like that. And it even doesn't really synergize all that well with Teacher, because if Teacher gets a disciplinary weights while you have an Andric down, then the card that you draw is increased by 3, and their card's cost is increased by 6. However, it's a really powerful Empower effect. It does actually do a lot of ridiculous stuff. Like, basically this card just gives you a beastly amount of attack power on anything that you're playing on turn 5. So if you're going to basically play this as your 4-drop on turn 5 and then play your power, then you get a really nice Empower that's going to basically cause any sort of flying unit to go across for a tremendous amount of damage. So for example, if you have a Bleak Base and Guide on 3 and you play like an Andric into some other option, you could do some pretty cool stuff with that. Any type of Empower focused deck is going to be pretty happy with Andric, because Andric provides all of the necessary things for an Empower focused deck to work pretty well. And I would say that he opens up the ability for Empower focused decks to be powerful in ranked, where currently Corendon is not really seeing a lot of play on that front. So if you want to play with, say, the Combre Emissary, the 2/2 that allows you to empower twice, if you want to play with Voice of the Speaker and a bunch of Empower cards like District Infantry, like the Resilient Wagoneer, which was recently buffed and was mostly just a draft card at that point, Bleak Base and Guide, which was not recently buffed but was still kind of an interesting aggressive card that unfortunately dies to too many things. Like, Empower has some interesting options, and there are a lot of things in Corendon that people haven't really been given the opportunity to play with, just because those Empower decks are not very, very powerful right now. So this is something that can provide a lot of interesting boons to that particular style. And if you don't want to play Empower, I think there's enough things going on with Andric that you're going to be pretty happy with him anyways. Not only does he have the Pledge ability, where basically he can fix for 3 different colors on your first turn, which is really, really handy for making sure that you have good power bases and making sure that you have a decent setup. If you're playing in Corendon, you will probably want to just play Andric just so you can have that pledge, and that's something that's going to be true of most of the tricolor cards. But also, like, this card gives you all of the necessary tools to sort of function in mid-range and function in control. It's a hard card to kill. Adds a lot of power to your deck, it stops your opponent's control stuff from happening, and it also fixes and does, basically it's just filling a lot of different slots. So there's a ton of interesting places where this card provides power. The one place where it doesn't have a lot of power is that it is a pretty weak stat line, and the Empower ability isn't necessarily going to be something that helps you out if you aren't playing a lot of units. So there are particular decks that are going to benefit the most from Andric, specifically large Empower decks and anything with a lot of tokens or a lot of flyers. A lot of units in general. So high unit counts and Andric go together very well, but if you're playing just sort of a slow control deck, it's going to be hard to justify this card, I think, in that particular setup. Nonetheless, fixing for all 3 colors is pretty important. We'll see exactly how good this card ends up being. I think there's a lot of power there, and I think it's probably going to be a staple Corendon card in the set to come. Okay, or at least in the upcoming meta. So the last one's real fun. We have a new Cockroach. It's called Glasshopper. It is a 2-cost 1/3, and it's got a lovely ability. Your units with Pledge cost 1 less, with the summon that if you pledged a unit this game, create and draw a copy of that unit. There's some testing to be done here to see if we can figure out some way to, like, Trail Stories, a Kindle to play, like, some Voice of the Speaker and double to play like a Combre Emissary or a Camel and double pledge something and see if we can actually get 2 cards off of Glasshopper. That's not going to be a good idea, but it's something that we have to see if it can actually happen, because that's an interaction I really want to know about. But yeah, so a couple of things about Glasshopper that are particularly good. First off, most of the units with Pledge are actually pretty solid, and the units with Pledge in Time are particularly strong. The one that's most important to know about is Moonstone Moonstone Vanguard, which is, of course, a 5-drop that actually sees active play in current Firetime Primal decks. That card being pledged off of a Glasshopper means that you not only get a card draw off of Glasshopper when you play it, but you also then get a 4-drop to play later on that is a 5/5. Whenever it attacks, you draw a card, and whenever you block, you get some health, and that card has endurance. It's very nasty, does a lot of bad things. Sakalis the Burning Sand is also a 4-drop that costs 3 when you're playing a Glasshopper, which is pretty nuts. So mono time decks alone have reasons to play Glasshopper, and potentially with a decent amount of good pledge stuff, you can do some really, really wild stuff with that. There's a lot of different possible pledge cards on the list that you can play around with, but the question is really going to be whether or not Glasshopper can support those types of decks and what specific types of pledge cards that they can play around with. And without looking at the exact list of pledge cards, I can't say if this is going to be a particularly popular ranked card. It is a Clockroach, so it benefits from having Clockroaches in your deck. Like if you are playing the 3-cost 2/2 that buffs Glasshoppers, then you actually get like a little bit of extra stats from that. If you are playing it with Toctic, you now have 3 different sources of Clockroaches, and then you can like Maskmaker Clockroaches. None of those things are like gonna add a lot of power to your deck, but they're fun things to play with, and certainly having more Clockroaches is never a bad idea, especially when they all have delightful pun names and are just really, really lovely to play. The stat line overall means that unless you are playing with pledge cards, you do not want to run Glasshopper in your deck. Like I would say that even with a Clockroach-based deck, you're going to want at least some pledge cards to play with. But it does open up the possibility of playing some more Crown-based strategies, some other types of Clockroach decks that we haven't seen in a while. I'm really interested to see if this card can actually see some play, because it looks like it's a lot of fun. I think that overall, the thing that this opens up the most are any sort of like Firetime Primal type setups. If you want to play Corendon with Pledge, that's definitely a possibility. Basically, anywhere that you've got a little bit of Pledge stuff to play around with, then Glasshopper can help you out and give you some really, really interesting options. So Big Praxis, Firetime Primal, Corendon, lots of different places for Glasshopper to have a little bit of fun, and I think anywhere where you can play Moonstone Vanguard and Psycholis, you're probably going to be pretty happy to play a Glasshopper, and that could be a lot of fun to see. So if you've got a deck that actually runs those two cards together, that's probably the best place to hit it. If you can find some other options with Pledge, there are a couple of good ones in different sets, but it's a little hard to say if you can justify, like, say, Time Justice Primal for the really fascinating Anaya Arctic Shepherd, or many of the like really, really good ones are in like Fire Justice or Ixtun. There's a lot of cool Pledge cards there that I really want to play with, but it's kind of hard to get into those colors while also playing Time. So I think this is a card that's going to be growing for next set for sure, because that should open up a wide variety of new pledges for the next 5 colors that are basically going to be paired up. So whenever we get into those tricolors in whatever the next set is, Glasshopper is going to be, I think, a lot better then, because there will be a wider variety of pledge units around, and also a wider variety of color pairings that you can play with that Glasshopper can fit into. At the moment, there's 1 or 2 decks that the card fits into, and there's possibly like a sleeper hit deck that can actually do something cool with it. It doesn't seem like it does anything that's going to be amazingly influential on the meta, but I would say that that mono time list is going to look pretty interesting, and there might be an FTP deck that runs it, depending on whether or not FTP can afford to go away from all of its extremely good value units to play Glasshopper on 2, because there's a lot of stuff happening in Firetime Primal that doesn't really need cost reduction and is mostly just about playing as much value as possible, so playing cards that don't have immediate value may not be the thing that it wants to do, because Glasshopper is a card that doesn't give you a lot of value unless you are able to pledge something on turn 1, and that makes it a much better card that actually gives you a little bit of defense and also actively redraws you the pledge card later on, so you get to play a free power and then basically get that card back later on. So it's pretty fun stuff. Like, this card's clearly got some potential value going on, and in high pledge decks it's very, very good. The problem right now is that there aren't a lot of high pledge decks out there, but this is potentially a really good way to enable that, and with the new 3-color pledge cards that appear to be possibly a cycle in the upcoming set, like home or in the upcoming campaign, I think that might actually create some interesting options. So yeah, Glasshopper looks amazing, and I'm pretty excited about it. There's going to be some fun Clockroach decks that we can build, and yeah, I'm wild about how that's working. Alright, this is a real quick addendum to the brews. Curse Prophet Delyth, 3-cost Time Shadow 1/4. unblockable, and when Delyth hits the enemy player, he sees a vision of 2 random cards, draw 1 card of your choice, and then the enemy player draws the other. So as far as I know, this is a random pool of all creatable cards, similar to Nyctotraxine and other things. I think it would be super cool if this card generated like cards from the future or other stuff like that. I hope that Direwolf does something like that in the future. But like, yeah, like this is a wild card, and it's got a lot of interesting stuff going on with it. So super fun promo. This is actually one of my favorites of the year, I think, so far. Like, of the ones that we've seen released, like, this card just looks like it's a blast to play, and there's a lot of cool things about it. So, main things going on with it. It's a 3-cost 1/4, so it's pretty hard to kill for a 3-cost. Like, it's at least reasonably stat efficient. It's not going to die to anything that's going to be really unpleasant. It can die to, like, Defiance, but that's about it. Like, as a 1/4, it's probably the thing that's going to be relatively reasonable. It's unblockable, so it's not going to trade with anything. It doesn't die to Torch. It's hybrid colors, so it doesn't die to Annihilate. It can die to Suffocate, but that's not a particularly big deal, and it can't die to Vanquish. So most of the main things that would kill Delyth are not really super active in the meta. It's fairly sticky, and it's a fairly sticky unblockable unit, which means we're going to see that hit ability quite a bit. That hit ability is interesting. A lot of times it's going to give you a very good card and your opponent a very bad card. Both of you get to keep a card that is out of your colors, potentially very helpful, and also like is going to, like, every once in a while Delyth is going to see a vision that will kill you and not help you in any way. So like that's certainly something to keep an eye on. Also, it does give card advantage to both players, so if a player is trying to use discard strategies, anything like that, there are ways that Delyth can help out. It's not a card that gives card advantage, it's not a card that adds tempo to your deck. The main advantage that it has is that you get a decent amount of choice into what your opponent gets and what you get, which means that you will get pseudo card advantage over time as you give your opponent more and more useless cards and give yourself more and more useful cards. So very good stuff. But beyond that, like, I think that this card is really interesting. It's a total flavor win. It does a lot of really cool things. I like that Delyth sees a vision of sees 2 possible visions of the future, and then that both of you get to sort of live your future as far as that goes. I think that's a really neat gameplay opportunity. This is a good random card. It's not competitive, but it's definitely good enough to do some decent stuff. And if you have ways to discard bad random cards, then you can potentially throw garbage into both players' hands and use that for other purposes. We're going to be using it in like a Crown Roach deck in just a little bit. I think it's got a lot of fun potential to it. I can see a lot of fun decks running Delyth, and I'm really excited to build with this card. This is a great Johnny card. Overall, just an awesome setup. I would not say that it's a competitive ranked card, but I don't think that matters because it's way too fun not to play. So we're going to give that a shot, and yeah, it's going to be a delightful time. Looking forward to it. So that does it for today's spoiler breakdown. I will be back with more spoilers as soon as we have them, and we'll be putting up some more info and other games and stuff as soon as I've got the time to make them. In the meantime, I'm still streaming on Twitch. We're running all the new drops campaigns. We are doing a lot of Sunless Skies and a lot of Eternal and a lot of just whatever we feel like. It's really fun. Come on and join us at twitch.tv/LocalPojo. I've got a Patreon. That's about it. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see all the YouTube folks next time. Cheers.